Ilara didn't know that the man watching her from behind the ancient tome of bloodline histories was the most powerful alpha in the Seven Kingdoms. She didn't know that he had been searching for his fated mate for 7 long years, growing more desperate with each passing season, and she certainly didn't know that her quiet declaration, "Love isn't for me," would make him more determined than ever to prove her wrong. All she knew was that she needed to hide. The sounds of celebration echoed through the stone corridors of Ravencrest Palace, seeping through the heavy oak doors of the royal library like unwelcome ghosts. Another mating ceremony, another display of happily ever after that made her stomach turn and her chest ache with phantom pain. She pressed deeper into the shadows between the towering bookshelves, clutching a leather-bound manuscript to her chest like armour. "Love isn't for me," she reminded herself, the words worn smooth like river stones from constant repetition. Love is nothing but lies wrapped in pretty promises. The memory hit her without warning, sharp and merciless as it always was. 2 years had passed since she'd walked into that moonlit garden and found David with his hands tangled in Sarah's golden hair, their mouths locked together while wedding plans still sat unfinished on Ilara's desk. 2 years since she'd learned that love was nothing more than elaborate theatre, performed until someone better came along. 3 years of lies, she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible above the distant laughter. 3 years of believing herself cherished, only to discover she'd been nothing more than a convenient placeholder until he found someone worthy of his name and fortune. She had sworn that night, kneeling in her ruined wedding dress with her heart shattered beyond repair, that she would never again be foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. Real life didn't have happy endings for girls like her, girls who worked for their bread and had nothing to offer but a willing heart. The library door creaked open. Ilara froze, her breath catching as heavy footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor. No one came to the library during celebrations. No one sought refuge among dusty books when wine and dancing waited just corridors away. She shrank further into the shadows, hoping whoever it was would take what they needed and leave her to her solitude. Trying to escape the festivities as well? The voice was deep, warm like aged whiskey, and far too close. Ilara's head snapped up to find a man standing at the end of her row, one shoulder leaning against the bookshelf with casual grace. Her heart stuttered, then began racing for reasons she didn't want to examine. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. Dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, and eyes the colour of storm clouds before lightning strikes. He wore the simple black uniform of a palace guard, but something in the way he carried himself suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm not escaping," Ilara said carefully, setting the manuscript aside. "I'm working." At this hour. His mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "During the Crown Prince's mating celebration?" Heat flooded her cheeks. Of course he would know she was hiding. Of course he would call her out on the transparent lie. "Some of us don't find such displays entertaining." He moved closer, and she caught his scent, cedar and rain and something wild that made her pulse quicken, despite every logical thought in her head. There was something about him that felt familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. She would have remembered those eyes. "You don't believe in mated pairs?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his tone rather than mockery. "I believe in what I can see," Ilara replied, lifting her chin with more confidence than she felt. "And what I've seen is that love makes people cruel. It makes them liars. It gives them power to destroy you from the inside out." Something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or recognition. "Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question, and the gentle certainty in his voice made her chest tight. She turned away, pretending to organize scrolls that were already perfectly arranged. "Someone showed me the truth. Love isn't for me, it's for people who can afford the luxury of believing in fairy tales." And what if the fairy tale was real? His voice was closer now, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from his skin. What if love didn't have to hurt? Ilara's laugh was sharp, bitter. Then I suppose someone would have to prove it, but they'd have a very long wait ahead of them. When she turned back around, he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in his eyes, determination maybe, or the kind of patience that suggested he had all the time in the world. "Marcus," he said simply, extending a hand that was calloused like a warrior's, but gentle like a scholar's. "And you are?" "Ilara." The name slipped out before she could think better of it. His hand was warm, strong, and when their palms touched, electricity shot up her arm like lightning seeking ground. She jerked back, startled by the sensation, but he held on for just a moment longer. "Ilara," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "It's beautiful, like its bearer." "You don't know me," she said quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. "And I don't do flattery or charm or whatever this is." "What do you do?" Marcus asked, settling himself against the opposite bookshelf as if he had no intention of leaving any time soon. "I work, I read, I survive." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't get swept away by handsome guards who probably have a girl in every corner of the kingdom." His smile was slow, devastating. "Just one girl, actually, though I'm still trying to convince her that not all men are liars." Something warm unfurled in Ilara's chest, something dangerous that felt suspiciously like hope. She crushed it ruthlessly. "Then you'll be waiting a very long time." "Good thing I'm patient," Marcus said softly, "and good thing I don't give up easily." The celebration sounds swelled beyond the library doors, reminders of a world full of people who still believed in happy endings. Ilara looked at this stranger, who spoke of patience and persistence, who made her skin tingle with just a touch, who watched her like she was something precious rather than broken. "Love isn't for me," she told herself again. But for the first time in 2 years, the words felt less like certainty and more like a prayer she was afraid to stop believing. The days that followed were a strange rhythm of anticipation and resistance. Marcus began appearing in the library every afternoon, always with some excuse that sounded official enough to pass casual scrutiny. He needed to research territorial boundaries for the guard captain. He was looking up historical precedents for peace treaties. He required genealogical records for some unnamed administrative task. Each excuse was more transparent than the last, but Ilara found herself looking forward to the soft knock on the oak doors, the familiar footsteps crossing marble floors, the way her treacherous heart lifted despite her best intentions. "You know," she said on the 4th day, not looking up from the census record she was cataloguing, "the archive storage is in the West Wing. Most of what you're asking for would be there." "I prefer the ambience here," Marcus replied easily, settling into what had become his usual chair at the research table. Today he'd brought 2 steaming cups of tea, setting one within her reach without comment. Better lighting, more knowledgeable company. Ilara's fingers stilled on the parchment. The tea was perfect. Honey and bergamot, exactly as she liked it. She'd never told him how she preferred it prepared. "How did you—" "Lucky guess," he said, but something in his voice suggested it was anything but luck. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, using it as an anchor against the dangerous flutter in her chest. "You shouldn't be bringing me things. People will talk." "Let them talk." His tone was casual, but when she glanced up, his storm-grey eyes were intense. "What they think doesn't change what's real." "And what's real?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face like he was memorizing every detail. "That you haven't smiled, not once. In all our conversations you haven't let yourself smile." The observation hit her like a physical blow. She set down the tea with hands that trembled slightly. "Maybe I don't have much to smile about. Or maybe you're afraid of what might happen if you do." Ilara stood abruptly, moving to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Outside, couples walked arm in arm along the rose-lined paths, lost in their own private worlds of whispered promises and stolen glances. Once she'd been one of those starry-eyed girls, believing that love was something beautiful instead of something that destroyed. "Tell me about him," Marcus said quietly. She didn't turn around. "About who?" "The man who convinced you that love is a lie." Her reflection stared back from the glass, pale and hollow-eyed. "His name was David. We were engaged for 3 years. He said he loved me, that I was everything he'd ever wanted. He said I was his heart." Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Right up until I found him with my best friend in our wedding venue, practicing a different kind of ceremony." The silence stretched between them, heavy with old pain and fresh understanding. Then she heard the soft scrape of Marcus's chair, felt his presence behind her like warmth from a hearth. "I lost my parents when I was 12, he said, his voice rough with remembered grief. "Raiders attacked our village. They killed everyone they couldn't use, took everything they couldn't destroy. I watched them die, and I couldn't do anything to stop it." Ilara turned, startled by the raw honesty in his words. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes held depths of pain that matched her own. "For years I believed that caring about anyone was just giving the world permission to take them away from you," he continued. "I built walls so high and thick that nothing could get through. I told myself it was strength, that independence was the only way to survive." "What changed?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "I realised that survival isn't living, and that the people who hurt us don't get to decide who we become." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "David was a fool who didn't deserve you, but his cruelty doesn't define your worth." Something in her chest cracked, a hairline fracture in the armour she'd built so carefully. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you stayed late every night this week to reorganise the historical archives because you noticed they were out of order. I know you've been bringing bread crusts for the library cat even though pets aren't allowed in this wing. I know you correct the scribes' mistakes not to embarrass them, but to make sure future scholars have accurate information." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I know you're kind, intelligent, and stronger than you believe, and I know that any man who would choose someone else over you is either blind or broken." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Pretty words don't change anything." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed, "but time might, and patience, and proving day after day that not all men are liars." He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements like he was approaching a wounded animal. When she didn't pull away, his fingers brushed her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realised had fallen. "Let me prove it," he said softly. "Let me show you that love doesn't have to hurt." The touch sent electricity through her entire body, that same strange current she'd felt when they first met. But this time, instead of pulling away, she found herself leaning into the warmth of his palm. For a moment, the world narrowed to just this: his hand on her face, his eyes searching hers, the space between them charged with possibilities she was afraid to name. She could smell cedar and rain and that wild something that made her pulse race. She could see the way his breathing had changed, could feel the way the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. He was going to kiss her. She could see the intention in the way his gaze dropped to her mouth, in the way he leaned infinitesimally closer. And God help her, she wanted him to. The wanting terrified her. Ilara jerked back, breaking the spell, her hand flying to her cheek where his touch still burned. "I can't. I'm not ready for this." Pain flashed across Marcus's features, but it was quickly replaced by understanding. He dropped his hand but didn't step away. "Then I'll wait." "You say that now, but—" "I'll wait," he repeated, with such quiet conviction that it stole her breath. "However long you need, Ilara, I'll wait." She stared at him. This man who claimed to be just a guard, but carried himself like royalty. who spoke of patience like he had eternity to spare, who looked at her like she was something precious instead of broken. "Why?" she whispered. Marcus smiled then, soft and devastating, and full of promises she was afraid to believe. "Because you're worth waiting for, and because when you're ready, when you choose to trust me, it won't be because I wore you down or convinced you. It'll be because you decided I was worth the risk." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe, to think, to rebuild the walls that his touch had threatened to crumble. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, as casually as if her world hadn't just tilted on its axis. Ilara nodded, not trusting her voice. As he walked away, she pressed her fingers to her cheek where his hand had been, where warmth still lingered like a brand. Something golden and impossible was unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "Love isn't for me," she told herself, but the words felt fragile now, as delicate as spun glass. Maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely true. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and tentative trust. Marcus came to the library every day without fail, bringing tea that was always perfectly prepared, asking questions that drew her into conversations that lasted hours, sharing pieces of himself like gifts she was afraid to accept but couldn't bring herself to refuse. He told her about growing up on the northern borders, about learning to fight before he could properly read, about the weight of expectations that had shaped him into someone harder than he'd ever wanted to be. She found herself sharing things in return, her love of ancient poetry, the way she taught herself 6 languages by reading diplomatic correspondence, how she'd once dreamed of travelling to distant kingdoms before life taught her that dreams were dangerous luxuries. She began to look forward to his visits with an intensity that terrified her, began to catch herself smoothing her hair before the afternoon hour when he typically arrived, began to feel hollow on the rare days when his duties kept him away. It was dangerous, this growing warmth in her chest. Dangerous and impossible, and everything she'd sworn to never feel again. But when he looked at her like she was something miraculous instead of broken, when he listened to her thoughts like they mattered, when he touched her hand and made her feel like lightning was dancing beneath her skin, it became harder and harder to remember why love was supposed to be painful. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning when she took the wrong corridor. Ilara had been carrying a stack of treaties to the diplomatic archive when she'd gotten turned around in the maze of palace hallways. These upper floors were restricted, she knew, but surely no one would mind if she was just trying to find her way back to the main library. She rounded a corner, looking for a servant to ask for directions, and froze. Through an open doorway she could see into what was clearly a royal chamber. Tapestries bearing the kingdom's crest hung from stone walls. Maps covered a massive oak table. And standing at the centre of it all, speaking with advisers who bowed when they addressed him, was Marcus. Except he wasn't dressed in a guard's simple uniform. He wore midnight blue silk with silver threading, a circlet of white gold resting on his dark hair, and an aura of command that made the air itself seem to bend around him. Marcus wasn't a guard at all. Marcus was the Alpha King. The treaty slipped from her numb fingers, scattering across the marble floor like fallen leaves. The sound echoed in the hallway, sharp and damning, and every head in the royal chamber turned toward her. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw the exact moment he realized she knew, saw the way his face went pale, the way he started toward her with desperate urgency. Ilara didn't wait to hear what he would say. She turned and ran. She ran through corridors that suddenly felt like a trap, past servants who bowed reflexively when they saw her panic, down stairs that seemed to go on forever. By the time she reached the library, her lungs were burning and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. He found her there, of course. She'd known he would. Had known that nowhere in this palace, his palace, would be beyond his reach. "Ilara!" His voice came from behind her, carefully gentle, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. "Let me explain." She kept her back to him, gripping the edge of her desk so tightly her knuckles went white. Explain what? That you've been lying to me for weeks? That everything you've said, everything you've made me feel, has been built on deception? That's not... Marcus? She turned to face him, and the pain in her chest was so sharp it stole her breath. That's not even your real name, is it? Something cracked in his composed expression. It is my name. My full name is Marcus Alexander Thorne. I never lied about that. Just about everything else. The words came out flat, lifeless. About who you are, what you are, about being a simple guard who happened to need library access. He stepped toward her, hands raised like he was approaching something fragile. I am exactly who I've been with you, the man who brings you tea, who listens to your thoughts, who thinks you're remarkable. That's real. That's me. No. Ilara shook her head, backing away until she hit the bookshelf behind her. That was a performance, a game, the all-powerful Alpha King, amusing himself with the broken librarian. Were you laughing about it with your advisors, about how easy it was to make the pathetic little human girl trust you? Stop! The word came out sharp, commanding, and for a moment she glimpsed the true power beneath his careful facade. Don't do that. Don't diminish what's between us. What's between us? Ilara laughed, and the sound was bitter as winter wine. There is no us. There's the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms, and there's a nobody who organises his books. There's a king who needs a queen worthy of his throne, and there's a servant who was stupid enough to think fairy tales might be real. You are not nobody. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but each word rang with conviction. You are everything. You are intelligent and kind and brave and beautiful, and any kingdom would be honoured to have you as their queen. The words hit her like physical blows. Queen. He was talking about making her queen, as if such a thing were possible, as if the distance between them could be bridged by pretty speeches and royal decree. Don't. She held up a trembling hand, tears burning behind her eyes. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't offer me things that will be taken away the moment your advisors remind you of reality. I am the reality, Marcus said fiercely. I am the king, and I choose. You choose based on politics and bloodlines and treaties. The tears were falling now, and she couldn't stop them. You choose based on what's best for the kingdom, not on what a foolish librarian makes you feel during stolen moments in dusty rooms. That's not true, isn't it? Ilara wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to gather the shattered pieces of her composure. How long have you been looking for your fated mate, your Majesty? How many years of royal marriage negotiations have failed because you were waiting for that magical bond to appear? The way his face went carefully blank told her everything she needed to know. 7 years, she continued, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. 7 years of searching, and suddenly you feel something with a nobody in a library. How convenient, how perfectly timed. Except I'm not your mate, am I? I'm just someone who made you feel something real for the first time, and you convinced yourself it had to be fate, because the alternative was admitting you're as capable of ordinary attraction as any other man. You're wrong. But his voice lacked conviction, and that tiny hesitation was enough to destroy what little hope she'd been clinging to. I told you love isn't for me, Ilara said, her voice steady despite the way her world was crumbling. I told you I don't do fairy tales, and what did you do? You created the biggest fairy tale of all, the king and the servant girl, the powerful alpha and the broken human. You made me believe I could be something I'm not. You are exactly what you are, Marcus said desperately. You are perfect the way you are. I'm a librarian with no family name, no dowry, and no political value. She moved toward the door, needing to escape before she completely fell apart in front of him. I'm exactly what David taught me I was, a placeholder until something better comes along. Ilara, please. He caught her wrist as she passed, and the familiar electricity sparked between them. But this time, instead of comfort, it felt like mockery. Don't leave, not like this. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, a king's hand, marked with calluses from weapons training and rings that cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime. Then she looked up into storm-grey eyes that had made her believe in impossible things. "Let me go," she whispered. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, his fingers loosened and fell away. Ilara walked to the door, each step feeling like she was tearing something vital from her chest. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. "I quit," she said quietly. "Find someone else to organise your books, Your Majesty. And find someone else to play your fairy tale games with, someone who can actually give you what you need." She left him standing there in the library that had been their sanctuary, surrounded by the books that had witnessed their impossible connection bloom and die. Left him with the echo of her footsteps and the devastating truth neither of them could deny. He was a king, she was nobody, and love, once again, had proven to be nothing but elaborate lies wrapped in beautiful promises. The tears didn't start until she was safely locked in her tiny room in the servants' quarters, sobbing into her pillow while her heart shattered all over again. But this time, the breaking felt different, bigger, because this time she'd actually believed. This time she'd been fool enough to think that maybe, just maybe, love could be something other than pain. 3 weeks later, Ilara had almost convinced herself she was healing. The cottage she'd rented in Millhaven was small but clean, with windows that overlooked rolling fields instead of palace gardens. She'd found work at the village's modest library, cataloguing genealogies and land records for farmers who paid in fresh bread and honest smiles. It was quiet, simple, safe, everything she'd told herself she wanted. She didn't think about storm-grey eyes or the way her name had sounded on his lips. She didn't wonder if he'd found someone else to bring tea to, someone worthy of his crown and his impossible promises. She didn't dream about the warmth of his touch or wake up with tears on her cheeks. She was fine. That illusion lasted until the morning she opened her cottage door to find 3 men in black leather waiting on her doorstep. "Ilara Thorne," the largest one said, and her blood went cold at the surname he used. Marcus's surname, the name she'd never had any right to claim. "I think you have the wrong person," she managed, but her voice came out thin and breathless. The man's smile was all teeth and malice. "Oh, I don't think so. You're exactly who Lord Aldrich is looking for, the little human who caught the Alpha King's attention. What did he call you? His weakness." Ilara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I don't know what you're talking about. I work in the village library. I don't know any kings." "Lying doesn't suit you, sweetheart." Another man stepped forward, and she caught the glint of silver at his hip. "We know all about your romantic interludes in the palace library. We know how the mighty Marcus Thorne spent his afternoons whispering sweet words to a nobody from the servants' quarters." "Lord Aldrich has a message for your precious king," the third man added, "and you're going to help us deliver it." She tried to slam the door, but the largest man caught it easily, his supernatural strength making her human efforts laughable. Before she could scream, rough hands seized her arms and the world exploded into darkness. When consciousness returned, she was somewhere cold and damp. Stone walls, no windows, the acrid scent of old blood and newer fear. Her wrists were bound behind her back, rope cutting into skin that was already raw from struggling. "Awake, are we?" The voice came from the shadows, cultured and smooth and wrong in ways that made her skin crawl. Excellent. I was beginning to worry we'd been too enthusiastic in our collection methods. A man stepped into the flickering torchlight, tall, pale, with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. Everything about him screamed predator, from his too-sharp smile to the way he moved like violence was his native language. "Lord Aldrich," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You know me? How flattering." He circled her like a wolf sizing up prey. "Though I suppose Marcus must have mentioned me. Did he tell you about our little territorial dispute? About how my claim to the northern provinces predates his by 3 generations?" Ilara said nothing, but her silence seemed to amuse him. No, well, I suppose he was too busy playing house with his pet human to discuss politics. Aldrich's smile turned vicious. Tell me, dear, did he make you pretty promises? Did he whisper about making you his queen? About how love conquers all and stations don't matter when hearts are true? Each word was a knife, cutting into wounds that hadn't had time to heal. He didn't promise me anything. Liar. Aldrich's hand shot out, gripping her chin with fingers that felt like ice. I can smell him on you still. The bond he thinks he's forged, the claim he believes he's staked. It's pathetic, really. The great Alpha King, reduced to pining after a servant girl like some lovesick pup. There is no bond, Ilara said through gritted teeth. I'm nobody to him. I left. I walked away. Did you now? Aldrich's laugh was like breaking glass. Then why, pray tell, has he mobilised half his army searching for you? Why have his trackers been scouring every village within 100 miles? Why does the mention of your name send him into such fascinating rages? The words hit her like physical blows. Marcus had been looking for her, had been searching, mobilising resources, caring enough to rage when he couldn't find her. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? Aldrich released her chin and stepped back. Shall we find out? I sent him a message 3 hours ago, a single black feather and a lock of your hair. If you truly mean nothing to him, he'll ignore it. He'll let Lord Aldrich handle his own problems and keep his attention on more important matters. He leaned closer, his breath cold against her ear. But if you matter, if you're the weakness I believe you are, he'll come. And when he does, I'll have the leverage I need to reclaim what's mine. Time moved strangely in the darkness. Hours or days might have passed. There was no way to tell in the windowless cell. Ilara's wrists bled where the ropes had cut, and her throat was raw with thirst, but she refused to beg, refused to give Aldrich the satisfaction of seeing her break. She told herself Marcus wouldn't come, that he was too smart to walk into such an obvious trap, that whatever he'd felt for her had died the moment she'd walked away, leaving him free to find a proper queen and forget all about the servant girl who'd briefly caught his attention. She almost managed to believe it. Then the screaming started. It began as distant shouts, quickly escalating into sounds of absolute terror. The clash of steel on steel, roars that sounded more animal than human. The stone wall shook with impacts that felt like earthquakes. Aldrich's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders that became increasingly desperate. Stop him! Bring him down! He's just one man! But the sounds suggested otherwise. They suggested something massive and furious and utterly unstoppable tearing through everything in its path. The door to her cell exploded inward. Marcus filled the doorway, but he looked nothing like the gentleman who'd brought her tea and listened to her thoughts. This was the Alpha King in all his terrible glory, eyes burning gold with supernatural fire, power radiating from him in waves that made the air itself tremble. Blood stained his clothes and hands, but none of it appeared to be his own. Ilara. Her name was a prayer and a promise and a threat all rolled into one. In 3 quick strides he was beside her, his hands surprisingly gentle as they worked at her bonds. I'm here. You're safe. I've got you. The ropes fell away, and she collapsed forward into arms that caught her easily, cradling her against a chest that was solid and warm and wonderfully alive. She breathed in cedar and rain and that wild something that was purely him, and for the first time in hours she felt like she could breathe properly. You came, she whispered against his throat. Did you think I wouldn't? His voice was rough with emotion and exhaustion. Did you think anything in this world or the next could keep me away from you? Tears she'd been holding back for hours finally spilled over. He said, Aldrich said you'd been looking for me, that you were angry when you couldn't find me. Marcus pulled back just enough to look into her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with infinite care. Angry? Ilara, I've been out of my mind. I've had every tracker in the kingdom searching. I've personally questioned every person who might have seen you. When I got his message, his jaw clenched. When I saw your hair in that envelope, I wanted to burn down the world." "But I left," she said, confusion and hope warring in her chest. "I walked away. I told you I quit." "You left because I hurt you, because I lied to you about who I was, and you had every right to feel betrayed." His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones like he was memorizing them. "But that doesn't change what you are to me. Leaving doesn't make you matter less. It just makes me more desperate to prove I can be worthy of you." Before she could respond, Aldrich's voice cut through the moment like a blade. How touching, the beast and his beauty reunited at last. Marcus moved without seeming to move, placing himself between Ilara and the doorway where Aldrich stood, flanked by what remained of his men. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You made a mistake, Aldrich," Marcus said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You could have challenged me for territory. You could have questioned my policies or my bloodline or my right to rule. Any of that I would have met with diplomacy." "But you touched her." Gold fire blazed in his eyes, and Ilara could feel the power rolling off him in waves. "You put your hands on what's mine, and for that there is no diplomacy, no negotiation, no mercy." Aldrich's smile faltered. "She's just a human, just a servant girl you've been amusing yourself with." "She is everything." The words rang with such conviction that they seemed to echo from the stones themselves. "She is my heart and my conscience and my reason for being better than I was. She is the woman I love, the person I choose above all others, and the future queen of this kingdom." The declaration hit Ilara like lightning, stealing her breath and stopping her heart. Queen. He'd called her his future queen, not as some impossible dream, but as simple fact. "And you," Marcus continued, turning his full attention back to Aldrich, "are a dead man." What followed was less a fight than an execution. Marcus moved with lethal grace, every strike precise and devastating. Aldrich's supernatural strength meant nothing against an Alpha King in full fury, protecting what he loved. It was over in moments, leaving only silence and the metallic scent of justice served. When Marcus turned back to her, the gold fire had faded from his eyes, leaving only storm grey and infinite tenderness. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," Ilara managed, though she was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "Scared, but fine." He gathered her into his arms again, lifting her easily and carrying her toward the doorway. "Let's get you home." "Marcus," she said as they emerged into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness, "what you said in there, about me being your future queen, I meant every word." He looked down at her, and she saw truth burning in his eyes like a beacon. "I know you don't trust me. I know I have to earn back everything I destroyed with my deception. But Ilara, you are my choice. Today, tomorrow, every day for the rest of my life. Politics can go to hell. The kingdom can adjust. You are who I want." She stared up at him, this impossible man who'd torn apart an enemy stronghold to reach her, who'd called her everything in front of witnesses, who was looking at her like she hung the moon and stars. "You could have been killed," she whispered, "coming here for me. You could have died." Marcus's smile was soft and devastating, and full of promises she was finally ready to believe. "Then it would have been worth it, because a life without you isn't living at all." As they left the ruins of Aldrich's stronghold behind, Ilara felt something shift in her chest. The walls she'd built so carefully, the defences that had kept her safe and alone, began to crack and crumble. Maybe love didn't have to be pain. Maybe sometimes love was a man who'd move heaven and earth to keep you safe. The days that followed were a gentle healing. Marcus brought her to his private chambers, not the formal royal quarters with their gilded furniture and ceremonial trappings, but rooms that were quietly comfortable, filled with books and soft lighting, and windows that overlooked gardens instead of courtyards. He gave her space to recover, to process, to decide what she wanted without pressure or expectation. He didn't leave her alone, but he didn't crowd her either. He simply existed in her orbit, bringing her meals she was too shaken to ask for, sitting beside her bed when nightmares woke her gasping, reading aloud from poetry collections when the silence grew too heavy. On the third night, when she'd finally stopped jumping at every shadow and her hands had stopped trembling, Ilara found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me who you were from the beginning?" Marcus looked up from the book he'd been reading, a collection of ancient ballads she'd mentioned loving weeks ago in the library. He closed it carefully, marking his place before meeting her eyes. "Because I wanted you to know me," he said simply. "Not the crown or the title or the power, just me. The man who thinks too much and laughs too little, who collects maps of places he'll never have time to visit, who's been alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company." Ilara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "But the deception was wrong," Marcus finished quietly. "I told myself I was protecting something precious, but really I was being selfish. I was so afraid you'd look at me differently if you knew, so afraid you'd see the crown instead of the man." "You mean the way I did when I found out?" Pain flickered across his features. "Exactly like that. And I earned every moment of your anger, every harsh word, every step you took away from me. I earned it by lying to you about something fundamental." Ilara studied his face in the firelight, seeing exhaustion and regret and something that looked like barely contained hope. "Tell me about David." "David?" Marcus frowned, confused by the apparent change of subject. "Tell me what you would have done if you'd been in his position, if you'd been engaged to someone for 3 years, and then you met your fated mate." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by something that might have been horror. "Ilara, no, you can't possibly think— Answer the question." Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. "If you'd been promised to someone else, and then you felt the bond with me, what would you have done?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I would have ended the engagement immediately, before I so much as touched your hand. I would have been honest about the situation, about what I was feeling, about what it meant. I would have given my former fiancée the respect of truth and the chance to walk away with her dignity intact. Even if it meant losing political alliances, even if it caused scandal. Even then." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Because honour isn't something you practice only when it's convenient, and love, real love, doesn't build itself on the wreckage of someone else's heart." Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes. It was the answer she'd hoped for, and the answer that made David's betrayal cut even deeper by comparison. "He told me I was being dramatic when I found them together, said it didn't mean anything, that it was just physical, that I should understand he had needs I couldn't fulfill. He was a coward and a fool." Marcus's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "And if he were here now, I'd challenge him to combat for the insult to your honour." "Even though I'm nobody?" "You are not nobody." The words came out sharp, almost angry. "You are brilliant and brave and beautiful. You are kind without being weak, strong without being cruel. You see the world clearly, but still choose to believe in goodness. You are everything any reasonable man could want, and the fact that David couldn't see that only proves how blind he was." Something cracked open in Ilara's chest, some tightly held knot of pain and self-doubt beginning to loosen. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make me believe I might actually be worth something." Marcus stood from his chair and moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain distance but close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes. "I don't make you believe anything. I just tell you the truth and hope someday you'll see yourself the way I see you." "And how is that?" His smile was soft, devastating. "Like someone I've been looking for my entire life without knowing what I was searching for. Like the answer to questions I didn't know how to ask. Like home." Ilara's breath caught. "Marcus, I know you're afraid," he continued gently. "I know David taught you that love is conditional, that it can be withdrawn the moment something better comes along. But what I feel for you isn't going anywhere. It's not dependent on your station or your bloodline or your ability to be the perfect queen. It just is, constant as gravity, inevitable as sunrise." "What if I can't be what you need?" The words came out small, vulnerable. "What if the kingdom needs someone stronger, someone with political connections, someone who knows how to be royal?" "The kingdom needs someone who will love its people the way you love dusty books and stray cats. Someone who sees worth in forgotten things and fights for the overlooked and dismissed." His hand moved slowly toward hers, telegraphing his intent, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. "The kingdom needs exactly who you are." This time she didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and steady and anchoring. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of believing you, of letting myself hope again, of trusting that this time might be different." She looked down at their joined hands. "Of falling so completely that if you change your mind, if you decide I'm not enough after all, it will destroy me." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her words with the gravity they deserved. "Can I tell you something about fear?" She nodded. "I've been afraid every day since I met you. Afraid you'd see through my disguise before I was ready. Afraid you'd reject me when you learned who I was. Afraid I'd never be worthy of the trust you'd given me, and terrified I'd already lost it forever." His thumb traced over her knuckles. "But I learned something watching Aldrich hold you captive, something I should have realized weeks ago." "What?" "The fear of losing you is nothing compared to the reality of living without you. The fear of not being enough pales next to the regret of not trying at all." His eyes found hers, steady and sure. "I'd rather risk everything on the chance that we could be extraordinary together than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Ilara stared at him, this impossible man who spoke of forever like a promise instead of a threat, who looked at her like she was something miraculous instead of broken. Something warm and golden was unfurling in her chest, pushing against the walls she'd built to keep herself safe. "When you were in that cell," she said slowly, "when I thought you might not find me, might not come at all, I realized something too." "What?" "That I wasn't afraid of you not caring enough to look for me. I was afraid that you would care, that you'd risk yourself for someone who'd walked away from you. I was afraid that my stubbornness, my inability to trust, might get you killed." She took a shaky breath. "And I realized that somewhere along the way you'd become more important to me than my fear." Marcus's eyes closed briefly, like her words were a prayer answered. "Ilara." "I don't know how to do this," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't know how to be vulnerable or trusting or brave enough to love someone who could break me completely. But I want to learn. If you're patient with me, if you can forgive me for running away when things got complicated, I want to try." "There's nothing to forgive." Marcus said fiercely. "You protected yourself the only way you knew how. You survived, and that's all that matters." "Is it?" Ilara searched his face. "Because I hurt you too. When I accused you of playing games, of laughing about me with your advisers, when I compared you to David, you were in pain. People in pain lash out at whatever's closest, even if it's what they love most." His free hand came up to cup her cheek, especially if it's what they love most, because that's where they're most vulnerable. Love. He'd said love so casually, like it was a simple fact rather than a terrifying possibility. "Do you really think?" She couldn't finish the question, couldn't quite voice the hope that was blooming fragile and new in her chest. "That you love me?" Marcus smiled, and it was soft and knowing and full of patience. "I think you're brave enough to consider the possibility, and I think that's enough to start with." Ilara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as his thumb brushed across her cheekbone. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally protected by someone who saw her completely and chose her anyway. "Stay with me tonight?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. Not for anything physical, just stay, so I don't have to be alone with my thoughts." "Always," Marcus said simply. "Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'll be here." He settled beside her on the bed, fully clothed and careful to maintain respectful distance, but close enough that she could hear his heartbeat, steady and reassuring in the darkness. Close enough that when nightmares tried to creep in, his presence held them at bay. As sleep finally claimed her, Ilara's last conscious thought was that maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to hurt after all. Maybe sometimes love was patient hands and gentle words, and someone who stayed when staying was hard. Maybe sometimes love was choosing to trust despite fear, to hope despite past pain, to believe that this time, finally, could be different. Maybe sometimes love was exactly what she'd found in a library with a man who brought her tea and made her feel like she was worth waiting for. 2 months later, Ilara stood at the edge of the palace ballroom, watching nobles in silk and velvet dance beneath crystal chandeliers, and tried not to feel like she was drowning. The gown Marcus had commissioned for her was beautiful, midnight blue silk that complemented her eyes, with silver threading that caught the light like captured starlight. The necklace at her throat was a family heirloom, diamonds and sapphires that had belonged to queens for 3 centuries. She looked the part of a royal consort, but the whispers that followed her through the crowd made it clear that appearance was only surface deep. "I heard she worked in the library." A servant girl, can you imagine? What could the king possibly see in someone so common? Each word was a needle, piercing the fragile confidence she'd built over the past weeks. Ilara pressed closer to the wall, wishing she could disappear into the shadows the way she had that first night in the library. Second thoughts. She turned to find Marcus beside her, devastatingly handsome in formal black with the crown of white gold resting on his dark hair. But his eyes were concerned, focused entirely on her rather than the room full of people vying for his attention. "Just wondering if your advisors are right," she said quietly. "If maybe the kingdom deserves someone who was born for this." Marcus's expression darkened. "My advisors can go to hell, and so can anyone else who thinks your worth is determined by your bloodline." He moved closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used when they were alone. "Are you having doubts about us? About what we're building together?" Ilara looked up into storm-grey eyes that had become her anchor, her safe harbour in every storm. Over the past months, he had proven his words with actions, patient when she woke from nightmares, understanding when trust came in fits and starts, celebrating every small victory like it was a miracle. He had never once made her feel like she wasn't enough. "No," she said and meant it. "Not about us. About whether I can be what they need me to be." "You already are." Marcus's hand found hers, warm and steady. "You've spent the last month learning 6 different diplomatic protocols, mastering 3 ancient languages, and charming every ambassador who's visited the palace. You've improved the literacy programs in 4 provinces and revolutionized the royal library system. You're exactly what this kingdom needs." Before she could respond, a commotion near the ballroom's entrance drew their attention. The crowd was parting, whispers rising like a tide, and through the gap came a figure that made Ilara's blood freeze. David. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago, golden hair perfectly styled, blue eyes bright with charm, wearing the colours of his father's house like they were royal robes. Behind him walked Sarah, her hand possessively on his arm, her smile sharp as a blade. "Your Majesty," David said, offering a bow that was perfectly correct, but somehow managed to convey insolence. "Thank you for the invitation to your celebration." Marcus's hand tightened on Ilara's, but his voice remained level. "Lord Hartwell, Lady Sarah, welcome." David's gaze found Ilara, and his smile turned predatory. And Ilara, my, How you've risen in the world, though I suppose we all find our level eventually." The words hit like physical blows, carrying the weight of every cruel thing he'd ever said, every way he'd made her feel small and worthless. Ilara felt herself beginning to shrink, old patterns of shame and self-doubt rising like floodwater. Then Marcus stepped forward. "You will address her as Lady Ilara," he said, and though his voice was quiet, it carried the weight of absolute authority. "And you will do so with the respect due to the woman I love and intend to marry." The ballroom went silent. Every conversation stopped, every eye turned toward them, every breath held in anticipation of what would come next. David's smile faltered. "Marry? Surely you're not serious. She's nobody. No family, no dowry, no political value. What could she possibly offer a king?" "Everything," Marcus said simply, and the word rang through the silence like a bell. "She offers intelligence, compassion, strength, and a heart generous enough to love even those who don't deserve it. She offers truth in a world full of flattery, courage in the face of cruelty, and grace under pressure that would break lesser people." He turned slightly, including Ilara in his gaze while still addressing the room. "She offers partnership instead of subservience, challenge instead of compliance, and love instead of political convenience. She offers exactly what I've been looking for my entire life." "But the bloodline," someone called from the crowd. "Will be what we make it," Marcus cut them off. "Power doesn't come from breeding, it comes from character, and I would rather have one woman of true character beside me than a dozen princesses born to titles they've never earned." He reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made Ilara's heart stop beating entirely. "Love isn't for me," she heard herself whisper, the old defence rising automatically. Marcus smiled, soft and knowing, and full of infinite patience. He opened the box, revealing a ring unlike anything she'd ever seen. Not the massive stones that proclaimed wealth and status, but something delicate and beautiful, with a centre diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like captured stars. "Then explain this," he said gently. Ilara stared at the ring, her vision blurring with tears. "Marcus, you don't have to. This ring has been in my family for 8 generations, he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "It was made for King Alexander's wife, a baker's daughter who captured his heart with her kindness and her courage. It was worn by Queen Isabella, who started as a village healer and ended as the most beloved ruler in our history. It was worn by my grandmother, who was a refugee from a neighbouring kingdom and became the strongest queen our people had ever seen." He dropped to one knee, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. "It's not meant for princesses born to power, Ilara. It's meant for women who earn their crowns through love and service and the kind of strength that can't be inherited. It's meant for women who choose to build something beautiful instead of inheriting something hollow." Tears were flowing freely now, but Ilara no longer cared who saw them. "You're sure? Even though I'm nobody? Even though I bring you nothing but complications and scandal?" "You bring me everything that matters," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You bring me home. You bring me peace. You bring me a love I thought existed only in fairy tales." His smile widened. "And you're not nobody. You're everything. You're my heart walking around outside my body, my conscience, my partner, my equal, and if you'll have me, my wife." The silence stretched, electric and expectant. Ilara looked around the ballroom at all the faces watching them, some curious, some disapproving, some openly hopeful. She saw David's shock and Sarah's poorly concealed fury. She saw nobles who'd whispered about her bloodline and advisers who'd questioned her worthiness. Then she looked back at Marcus, kneeling before her with a ring that had belonged to queens who'd started as nobody, who'd proven that love and worth had nothing to do with the circumstances of your birth. "Yes," she said, and the word came out stronger than she'd expected. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be your partner and your equal and your wife. I'll help you rule with compassion and wisdom, and I'll love you every day for the rest of our lives." The ballroom erupted in applause, some genuine, some polite, some stunned, but Ilara heard none of it. All her attention was focused on Marcus as he slipped the ring onto her finger, as he rose and pulled her into his arms, as he kissed her with all the tenderness and passion she'd once thought existed only in stories. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, speaking too quietly for anyone else to hear. "Are you ready for this? Ready to be a queen?" "I'm ready to be your queen," Ilara corrected. "To stand beside you and help you be the king our people deserve. To prove that love isn't about what we're born with, but what we choose to build together." "Together," Marcus agreed, and in that single word was every promise she'd ever dreamed of hearing. As the celebration swirled around them, as nobles bowed and musicians played, and the future stretched out before them bright with possibility, Ilara finally understood the truth she'd been too afraid to believe. Love didn't have to hurt. Love didn't have to be temporary or conditional or cruel. Sometimes love was patient hands and gentle words, and someone who saw your worth even when you couldn't see it yourself. Sometimes love was a choice made new each day, a commitment that deepened rather than faded, a partnership built on respect and trust, and the kind of devotion that would weather any storm. Sometimes love was a fairy tale that turned out to be real after all. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Ilara and Marcus's journey in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of healing and second chances, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people discover these tales of love conquering fear. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of a love that lifts you up rather than tears you down, and that the right person will see your value even when the world tries to convince you otherwise.